July 9th, 2024. Japan's defense ministry is scrambling after an unknown interloper enters the country's air defense identification zone. That interloper doesn't have a pilot, but it has a definite country of origin: China. Japan sends out some of its own Air Self-Defense Force, or ASDF, fighter jets to confront the Chinese aircraft, which is discovered to be a TB-001 reconnaissance and attack plane. The latest and greatest drone developed by Beijing, the TB-001, has a 3,700-mile range and can stay in the air for up to 35 hours. Far more worrying for Japan is that the drone carries missiles, including several 44-pound Class AR-2 air-to-surface missiles, a 176-pound AR-4 missile, and the guidance systems those missiles need to find their targets. What's that drone doing over Japanese airspace? Thankfully, it wasn't there to attack. Japan's planes fly up to meet it and fly practically alongside the TB-001 as it travels between Okinawa Island and Miyako Island before making a sharp U-turn, heading back along the same route and then flying back in the direction of China. The threat is averted, but that doesn't change the fact the threat was made in the first place. China is letting Japan know that it has eyes on it. Worse yet for Japan, this is the 6th time since the beginning of 2024 that its defense ministry has been forced to track the movements of an unmanned Chinese aircraft. The threat from China is real, and it's a threat that Beijing is making consistently. Naturally, the response from Japan is the only logical one it can make. It's preparing for the possibility of yet another war with its greatest rival. Here we'll discuss some of the preparations Japan is making to ensure it's ready in case a war with China comes. But to understand why Japan is gearing up to fight, it's important to understand the justifications it has for getting ready. The first of those justifications is clear: Japan and China have a long history of war. In fact, China would likely consider Japan to be one of the main perpetrators of what many in China call the Century of Humiliation. Running between 1839 and 1949, meaning it's a little over a century, this period saw China experience a marked fall from grace compared to the dynastic days. The country ceded large portions of its territory to foreign powers, particularly those in the West, with the entire century now forming the backbone of the founding narrative of modern China. Such humiliation, China feels, must never be experienced again. Though much of the Century of Humiliation revolves around the West, Japan played more than a crucial role in it thanks to two Sino-Japanese wars. The first of these, which took place between 1894 and 1895, saw Japan emerge as the dominant player in the Indo-Pacific. Both China and Japan laid claim to Korea during that time, with China perhaps having the strongest claim, due to Korea having served as a client state to China for decades. However, the country's strategic location, combined with Korea being a source of iron and coal, attracted Japan's interest. Japan made a power play in 1875. Having already started to adopt Western technology, Japan forced Korea to open itself to international trade while declaring itself independent of China. This set off a chain of events that led to a war being declared between Japan and China in 1894. That war showed how massively underprepared for the modern Indo-Pacific China had become. Though it had far more manpower than Japan, China was overwhelmed by Japan's naval and ground fighting technology, forcing it to sue for peace in 1895. China lost Taiwan, the Liaodong Peninsula, and the Pescadores in the ensuing treaty, as well as being forced to recognize Korea as an independent country. Having to pay Japan an indemnity while giving it trading privileges within Chinese waters only added to the humiliation. But this would only go from bad to worse in the Second Sino-Japanese War. By 1937, China felt ready to lodge resistance to ever-increasing Japanese influence within its territory. Initially, that resistance went poorly. Japan was still by far the more militarily adept nation, with the new wave of fighting only serving to a rapid Japanese advance through to 1938. That advance developed into a stalemate as most of the world, including Japan and China, became embroiled in World War II. Perhaps even more humiliatingly for China, it took the United States ending World War II with nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to force Japan's surrender and set the stage for the modernization of China into what we know today. The emergence of Mao Zedong, his communist philosophy, and the allegiance that philosophy brought with the Soviet Union helped China to finally begin modernization. Fast forward to today, and China now has one of the world's most advanced militaries. It's one of the few nations to develop nuclear weapons, 500 of them as of October 2023, and it's a major power player in the Indo-Pacific. In a sense, the roles have been reversed. Where Japan was once the aggressor before it was cowed into submission by Allied forces in World War II, now China is using its military might to exert its influence in the Indo-Pacific. The long history of war between Japan and China is not a distant memory. it still informs so much of what China does as it works to escape the belittlement it experienced during its century of humiliation. This doesn't mean that China is actively working toward invading and occupying Japan in the same way that Japan invaded China during the Sino-Japanese Wars. But it does ensure that China knows that it's so much of a threat in the modern era that Japan could do little to stop it as it tries to regain Taiwan and further exert its influence over the Indo-Pacific. At least that appears to be Beijing's goal. Which brings us to another reason as to why Japan is preparing for war with China. It believes China represents a clear and obvious threat to its security. That's the impression among Japan's citizens, according to an April 2024 report published in the South China Morning Post. The outlet notes that more than 90% of Japanese people now see China as a security threat, and it's not difficult to see why. The aerial incursions we detailed at the beginning of the video offer just one example of what China is doing to threaten Japan. There are many others, particularly naval threats. For instance, in May 2024, CNN reported that Japan had recorded the presence of Chinese Coast Guard ships lurking in the waters near the islands Japan controls in the East China Sea for 158 consecutive days. That period breaks all previous records, including the 157 days seen in 2021, and makes it clear that Japan takes this constant Chinese presence as a threat. Yoshimasa Hayashi, Japan's chief cabinet secretary, puts it clearly. The Japanese government takes very seriously the fact that there have been a succession of vessels sailing into the contiguous zone and trespassing in territorial waters. The contiguous zone stretches a further 12 nautical miles from Japan's territorial waters, something of a naval grey area in which military ships are allowed to enter. On the surface, Chinese ships entering those contiguous zones don't amount to the breaking of any international agreements. It's the constant presence that's a concern. Being there for over 150 days, and counting, is another example of China trying to use its military to intimidate and provoke Japan. Combine these deliberate acts of provocation with historical precedent, and you start to see the reasons as to why Japan is preparing for war with China. But to further clarify, Japan itself has explained why it's getting ready in its 2023 annual military white paper. Published in July 2023, the white paper defines China as the greatest strategic challenge Japan faces, also noting that China is amplifying its challenges to the status quo in the Indo-Pacific in an attempt to gain more power. Japan's response, as the white paper argues, is to counter these challenges by achieving military objectives of its own. Specifically, a three-pronged approach will see Japan take a more active role in influencing the Indo-Pacific security environment, responding to forceful changes to the status quo and tellingly disrupt and defeat a possible invasion. This brings us back to Japan preparing for war with China. How is it doing that? The annual military white paper offers some hints, with the biggest of these being that Japan is changing the approach it's had to its military for the first time since World War II. In June 2023, around the same time as Japan published its white paper, the Arms Control Association, or ACA, published an article discussing Japan's changing approach. It notes that December 2022 had seen Japan release a trio of planning documents before its report, with those documents containing commitments to increasing military spending and developing counter-strike capabilities. Those objectives represent a shift in Japanese policy, which is evolving from its post-World War II era into a policy adapted to the reality of the modern Indo-Pacific. In the wake of its defeat by the Allies, Japan adopted a military policy focused on self-defense and maintaining enough of a power baseline to prevent a vacuum of power from forming in East Asia. In other words, Japan was just strong enough to be respected without being so strong that it became the dominant power in the region that it had been before World War II. In essence, Japan aimed to maintain the status quo it speaks of in its 2023 annual report, positioning itself as a key influencer in the Indo-Pacific while helping to balance the changing powers of other countries in the region. The last 2 decades have seen that approach falter. China under President Xi Jinping has grown stronger and more threatening thanks to Xi's constant modernization of the country's military. The status quo can't be maintained because it doesn't exist anymore. China is spending more on its military than ever. The ACA says that it has a budget of $224.8 billion in 2023, and its army has become so powerful that it would likely defeat Japan in a war. Add to this a similar, though less predictable, military modernization of North Korea, and Japan can no longer afford to maintain a military solely for self-defense. The threat it faces in the Indo-Pacific is so large that a change to a more aggressive policy is needed. Don't underestimate the impact of this mindset shift in Japan's preparations. It has essentially upended over 50 years of policy to change how it approaches its military. In doing so, it's sent a message to China that it's gearing up for a conflict it hopes doesn't happen. Japan still won't start the war, it will always act in self-defense, but it also will no longer allow China to threaten or provoke without an appropriate response. To enable that response, Japan is beefing up its military ties. In addition to developing a self-defense force that's strong enough to guard its own interests, Japan has consistently pursued a policy of allying with other nations. We see this in its relationship with the United States. The country that brought defeat to Japan in World War II has become one of its greatest allies in recent years. The US maintains over 85 military bases in Japan, taking up about 77,000 acres, and has around 53,000 troops stationed in the country. This already sets a precedent of cooperation between the two nations, as well as sending a message to China that the US forces in Japan are watching it as closely as China watches Japan. Alliances like this will be key if China and Japan go to war. That's why Japan has spent the last few years strengthening these alliances. August 2023 brought with it the official announcement of a trilateral security agreement between Japan, the United States, and South Korea. That agreement, according to the White House website, involves improving all three countries' economies, supporting international order based on law, and most importantly, bolstering regional and global peace and security. In other words, the three countries are working together to ensure an increasingly strong China can't present as much of a threat in the Indo-Pacific. That trilateral agreement will result in American operations in Japan being extensively upgraded. That's according to a March 2024 Al Jazeera report, which quoted Hayashi when he told reporters that Japan and the United States have been discussing ways to strengthen cooperation in command and control in order to enhance interoperability and readiness. Both US President Joe Biden and Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida followed this up with a summit in April 2024, which most reports believed would focus on how America's military command in East Asia could be restructured to better account for the Chinese threat. Those structural shakeups are accompanied by increasing cooperation in trilateral military exercises, including Freedom Edge, which is set to take place in the summer of 2024. The message Japan sends here is clear. One of the world's most powerful countries is not only their ally, but is working directly alongside it to strengthen its position in the Indo-Pacific. Add to that America's commitment to defend Japan if an attack were to take place on its soil, in return for Japan agreeing to host American military bases, and you have another example of how Japan is preparing for war. But its alliances don't end there. In July 2024, the Financial Times reported on the signing of a landmark agreement between Japan and the Philippines. Focused on defense and military cooperation, the agreement grants each country reciprocal access to the other, opening the door for the Japanese and Philippine militaries to train alongside one another. That agreement came in the wake of the United States hosting a trilateral meeting between itself, Japan, and the Philippines in April 2024. It's notable because the Philippines is another country that's worried about China. Specifically, China's claims over the disputed territory in the South China Sea led the Philippine government to worry that their country could be as much of a target of Chinese aggression as Japan. What we're seeing here is something akin to the formation of an Indo-Pacific NATO. Granted, it doesn't have that name, but the similarities are there. Cooperative defense agreements are being signed, with the backing of the United States ensuring there's a hefty amount of muscle behind those agreements. Japan is strengthening through alliances, perhaps preparing to engage in a multi-front war with China that would see several other countries get involved. Still, make no mistake, Japan isn't merely relying on other countries to fight against China, it's bolstering its own military substantially. Earlier, we mentioned how Japan's 2023 annual report discussed the country's intention to increase its military spending. The proposals in that report were approved in December 2023. United States Naval Institute News, or USNI News, says that Japan will spend $55.9 billion on defense in 2024, which is a marked increase on the $47.7 billion it spent in 2023. Not only that, but the budget is set to increase annually between 2024 and 27, with that final year seeing it rise to $62.5 billion. While not as extensive as China's spending, as noted, it spent more than $200 billion in 2023 alone, Japan's increased spending will see it break annual spending records for 5 straight years, creating a total of $302 billion spent between 2023 and 2027. That's not all. Along with the increased spending, Japan's cabinet has approved the loosening of export restrictions that previously prevented it from shipping fully assembled lethal munitions to other countries. With that restriction gone, Japan can not only better equip itself, but can offer weapons to its allies in the Indo-Pacific, perhaps allies like the Philippines. Of course, increasing spending means little if there isn't a plan in place for how that money will be used. USNI News says that Japan intends to spend $8.78 billion of its budget on developing new integrated air and missile defense systems. These defenses will include the creation of a pair of Aegis system-equipped vessels, destroyers that are capable of shooting missiles out of the sky. Why does this matter? Missiles represent one of the largest threats that China's military poses. The country's rocket force has developed thousands of missiles, which Business Insider claims carry such catchy nicknames as the Guam Express and the Carrier Killer. The idea is to showcase how these missiles will be devastating to American forces in the Indo-Pacific, but their threat is just as clear to Japan. A war with China would have a significant naval component, with Chinese ships and planes likely to use missiles to attack Japan's navy, air force, and the country's mainland. Investing in missile defenses is a wise move, if only to minimize the damage China could cause with one of its most dangerous strategies. Other purchases include the inking of a deal with the United States that will see Japan buy around 400 Tomahawk missiles. These subsonic cruise missiles are designed to launch from US Navy vessels and submarines, though that shouldn't be a problem for Japan. Its cooperative agreements with the US should easily help it retrofit existing ships or ensure the Tomahawks are compatible with the new ships it builds. Each Tomahawk can carry a warhead weighing up to 1,000 pounds and has a range between 775 and 1,550 miles. The deal will cost Japan $2.35 billion, with the missiles intended to bolster Japan's naval attack prowess. Again, this is a key part of its strategy to fight against China, given that much of the war would likely take place at sea. Speaking of a war at sea, Japan is also preparing extensively for that and has been for several years. Beyond buying missiles and creating better defensive systems, it's beefing up its ships so that they can be more effective against China. The previously mentioned Aegis destroyers are a good example. In September 2022, USNI News reported that those destroyers will be 690 feet long and capable of displacing up to 20,000 tons of water. That far exceeds Japan's current Maya destroyers, which only displace 8,200 tons. According to Japan's former defense minister, Yasukazu Hamada, the Aegis destroyers will feature better crew quarters to enable longer deployments, as well as being large enough to handle rougher weather. In other words, they make Japan's navy more versatile. Better yet, Japan has built its first aircraft carriers. Sort of. In March 2024, National Interest reported that Japan had converted a pair of its Izumo-class helicopter carriers, the JS Kaga and KS Izumo, into aircraft carriers. Those carriers are equipped to operate F-35B Lightning II multi-role fighter jets, which are fifth-generation aircraft for which China has no real equal. Again, we're seeing Japan's pivoting of military strategy at play. Though they're converted helicopter carriers, these new aircraft carriers still show Japan bucking the trends of several decades. It hasn't had any kind of aircraft carrier since the end of World War II, with the conversion underpinning Japan's efforts to establish both naval and aerial power in the Indo-Pacific. Both would be crucial in a war against China, which has a larger navy and 3 aircraft carriers of its own. By this point, it's clear that Japan's investments are designed to counter Chinese threats. It hasn't achieved parity with China's military, at least not on its own, but its creation of aircraft carriers and building of larger ships shows that it's considering attack strategies for the first time in decades. Japan will not allow itself to be overwhelmed by China's navy or aerial offensive, and it will have defenses in place to guard it against a Chinese missile barrage. Those missile defenses are worth exploring further. Not only is Japan working on bolstering its military so that it comes closer to China's in terms of sheer power, but it's also introducing technological marvels to which China doesn't have access. Marvels like railguns. A railgun is an electrical weapon that traces its origins to the early 20th century. The weapon uses electromagnetic forces to propel a projectile at immensely high speeds, with the biggest benefit being that a railgun doesn't require chemical combustion to fire. Not only does that reduce per-launch costs, but it also makes railguns more accurate and capable of firing projectiles at faster speeds and over further distances than conventional weapons. So why aren't railguns in use all over the world? The simple answer is that they're incredibly difficult to scale up into suitable weapons. Reliability has consistently been a problem, with the rails that generate the electromagnetic force required to fire a projectile consistently failing to fire off multiple full-power shots before requiring replacement. According to Born to Engineer, a railgun that's worth deploying would need to be capable of firing 6 rounds per minute with rails that can withstand up to 3,000 rounds. The sheer temperatures generated within a railgun are also problematic. They reach up to 1,470 degrees Fahrenheit, which leads to plasma formation in the gun's bore and wreaks havoc on the guidance systems built into the railgun's projectiles. Overcoming those issues has been a major stumbling block in railgun development. The US gave up after spending more than a decade trying to make the technology workable. Most assumed that railguns would be confined to fiction for several more decades. Japan proved otherwise. October 2023 saw Japan become the first country to ever successfully test fire what the Eurasian Times called a medium-caliber maritime electromagnetic railgun from an offshore platform. In other words, Japan fired one of these weapons from a ship, showing that it had figured out how to power such a devastating weapon offshore, and has advanced the technology to the point where it may be usable in the near future. China has claimed to be working on railguns of its own, but has delivered no evidence. Japan, on the other hand, now has a weapon that's capable of firing projectiles so quickly that they would intercept the fastest combustion-propelled missiles in the world. Missiles like the hypersonic ones China claims to be developing. Voice of America reports that China's missile arsenal includes the DF-17, which is a medium-range ballistic missile that includes a glide vehicle capable of reaching hypersonic speeds. That means the DF-17 can travel at over 5 times the speed of sound, far faster than any missile defense system currently in use. Railguns come into play because their projectiles are also capable of reaching and exceeding hypersonic speeds, making them the only real defense against China's hypersonic missiles. To put it simply, Japan now has a working railgun. That railgun will help it in a war with China because it can both defend Japan against hypersonic missiles and fire with such force and accuracy that it's capable of destroying almost any Chinese ship. And a railgun is far from the only defense against the hypersonic threat that China is developing. In May 2024, AP News reported that Japan and the United States have signed a new agreement in which they'll work in tandem to develop a hypersonic missile defense system. Dubbed the Glide Phase Interceptor, the system will be deployed in the mid-2030s to provide both countries with a more conventional form of defense against China's growing missile threat. The development process will begin in March 2025, with Japanese manufacturers completing the bulk of the work, and the Glide Phase Interceptors will be deployed on Japan's Aegis-class destroyers. Where does this leave Japan as it prepares for a war with China? It has altered its approach to its military so that it's no longer solely concerned with maintaining the status quo. Instead, it's getting ready to fight, which has required it to recognize that China's threat is so high that its old policies are simply no longer workable. To confront that threat, Japan is building alliances within the Indo-Pacific, as well as solidifying its ties with the United States. The latter will be especially important. Having the US by its side means Japan can make up the extensive difference in strength between its military and China's military. Of course, Japan is actively strengthening its military too. It's spending more money than it's ever spent before, with that funding going toward building stronger ships and bolstering its missile defenses. Then there's Japan's trump card. It's a far more innovative country than China. Its success in developing an offshore railgun demonstrates this, as well as further showing that Japan is ready to take on the hypersonic missile threat China claims to pose. All of this isn't being done in secret. The information is publicly available, as are Japan's statements about China being an ever-increasing threat. Perhaps the real secret here is that Japan is far more prepared for a fight than China anticipated. It's been working behind the scenes, both to beef up its alliances and to develop weapons that will allow it to be competitive if a war with China ever broke out. That leads us to a final question. Do you think Japan could win if it goes to war with China? Share your opinions about Japan's military buildup and what it would mean for the war in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out Japan Shocks China by revealing 5 never-before-seen weapons, or click this other video instead.